you get to a common ground culturally coming in with that attitude. And it's not a popular attitude. Most of the marketing
No, I disagree with you.
I know. I can't wait to hear it.
I think we should talk about it.
The Margeteers.
Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Marg. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, great. Sun is shining in London. Who would have thought?
There we go. I love it. Well, I'm so glad that we have a chance to have a conversation today about sales and marketing. I think it's something that's pretty universal between any company.
I think there's such a history of sales and marketing being oil and vinegar, right? And how do we get them to interlace? And it's one of those aspects where, for some reason, they've always been set up to compete when, in my perspective, it's all you're traveling in the same direction. And how do you actually complement each other and go from there? So I think there's been a big change, at least in my career, from where we started and where we are now. And then also in my position to be able to say from the beginning, this is how I'd like to collaborate with you and be on the same team with you. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's kind of interesting because with a focus on STEM companies and a focus on startups, there's this period of time, I think, where you have a greater chance of having that disconnect because everyone's still trying to figure out the lay of the land, and you're still figuring out the roles and responsibilities and how everything's going to dovetail. But there's also kind of a misalignment, almost because the salespeople are trying to optimize for getting those initial customers and initial adopters. And marketing's still working on what's the messaging, what's the value proposition, and really trying to orchestrate all of their work for the push out of the message. And they're more focused on volume at the beginning than they are at really a refined funnel process. So I think it's just a little challenging in the beginning, for sure, during the startup phase.
And for startups, do you think how early do you think setting up lead scoring is important, and the aspects of, do you still believe in an MQL, SQL environment? If you're dreamed a utopian space, how do you so those who might not know, so it's marketing qualified leads and sales qualified leads. And for a very traditional perspective is marketing at the beginning of the year is tasked with finding this number of leads or this number of revenue and sourcing it. And sales is tasked with sourcing and closing. And the sourcing number, I've never worked at a company where it didn't change every year, and these definitions change every year. So it's hard to say, and how long does if you sourced it 2 years ago, who still gets credit, and is it that fiscal year, and so forth. So there's a lot of the ROI measurement required or from a CFO's perspective of the ROI to say, well, we're only going to invest in this if we know that we're going to get X amount leads, et cetera. And I think in some ways in B2C, it can be mildly easier because what you're trying to get to is the CPL, the cost per lead. So how much did marketing spend, effort, and paid, and whomever, how much did sales spend, marketing, paid, effort, et cetera, sponsorships, et cetera, to get one person into your database and then usher that person through the marketing process, sales process to completion, which is then the cost per acquisition. So I think I believe in these numbers, and in a modern digital way, you can capture these numbers and you can get to a point where you, within a range, can say it's going to cost us this much money to find new clients. And only when you have tested the different channels can you have something very clearly of saying, okay, these are the channels we're going to go to turn things on. There's a lot of testing that takes place to get there. But I think because of these initial KPIs is what sets the teams up for competition and saying, how are you remunerating somebody? How are you going to tell them they're doing a good job? And how do you then change the perspective going forward? I had a really interesting call with a friend a couple months ago, and in his organization, they convinced the group to give marketing a commission for things that closed, not just sales a commission. So it's a whole other incentive scheme that, quite frankly, I hadn't really thought of, to say now both teams are aligned in the way that they want things to close, or all parts of the funnel, does it mean that, I don't know how that worked in practice, like if the salesperson then had a perception of loss because marketing was getting some, I don't know if they lost some of their commission for marketing or if that was just an added bonus so everyone could feel collaboratively in that model. But I think this thing that you come in and trying to reframe that language that we are working together is almost the most important thing you can do as a marketer.
I agree 100%. And also the definition. So you mentioned earlier MQL and SQL. I think defining what actually makes an MQL is really important, and what actually makes an SQL is really important if you're going to have that business process. And not everybody does, but for the ones who do, alignment on what those qualifiers are is, I think, paramount. Because sometimes marketing thinks that they're feeding sales with leads, and then sales starts to get them into the business process and then says these folks are not qualified. And when that ratio is way off, if they're getting 80 or 90% of the people coming into the sales function are not qualified, then you know for sure that there's a big disconnect. So I almost feel like you have to work it from the other end. A lot of people try and start first, like, here's how we're going to define the marketing qualified lead, and here's how we're going to define the sales qualified lead, and then here's how we're going to define someone who's ready for this, or this stage of the funnel. This is how we're going to define how they move through the funnel and what those qualifiers are in order to move from stage to stage.
Sure.
I think you need to work back from the other side and instead define, okay, here's where we know a client is ready to close, and then reverse engineer it from that end of the spectrum instead of from the bottom up. It's almost like from the top down. I think that helps quite a bit.
Do you have examples of where that's kind of worked for you to overcome or come together as a team? Or
yeah, the coming together as a team really helped, because what that meant was that some of that near the bottom of the funnel activity started to hone in on whether it was a persona or a certain spend limit, whatever it was in their thing. It really helped identify who we thought that was going to be and to work backwards into that in order to define the marketing qualified lead. The other thing I think that's really important is that balance between quality and quantity. And I think incentivizing marketing on volume isn't the right thing to do. I think incentivizing marketing on the quality of the incoming prospects, I think that's far more important. But at the end of the day, we could have a whole nother conversation on attribution.
Sure.
Because when you were mentioning about the CFO earlier, sometimes they want to have quantifiable data on the quarterly or an annual cycle, where you and I know brand building activities, exposure in one-time events and things like that, they may happen 12 or 18 months before that customer has actually closed. And so trailing back the attribution into those activities in order to say, hey, that did turn out to be a qualified lead, or that did turn out to be a great SQL. There's so many touch points and so many things that have happened in that 12 or 18-month period. It's hard to tie it back to any singular marketing tactic or brand building tactic. So I think fundamentally the attribution system is broken. One of the greatest things that we can do as marketers is have a more realistic conversation with finance and with the CFOs in how we're actually going to measure the efficacy of the marketing spend. And on what cycles are we going to measure the efficacy of the marketing spend? And then, since the topic today is sales and marketing, getting that alignment with sales, because they're part of the process, having this be almost triangulated, like a three-way agreement between these organizations on how this measurement is going to happen. And then to your point earlier, how the incentives are going to happen is really important. And I would say it's different for different kinds of companies. It's different, for a SaaS versus professional services, different in different kinds of STEM companies that might have long sales cycles versus things where you're just driving top of funnel and people can convert themselves in a portal. There's so many nuances to that, but those conversations have to happen and that alignment needs to happen as early as possible. And then it needs to be checked in on regularly, at least once a year when you're going through the annual planning, at a minimum once a year, ideally quarterly.
And then do you believe in any like that kind of tag team spot where it's been marketing qualified, then sales has that chat versus the kind of parallel discussion, right? Where it's saying we agree along this whole aspect that this is outcome. I think what you're talking about, the quality versus quantity, is very interesting, especially in volume businesses. I think a lot of B2B clients occasionally, like, marketing just needs to source one client this year,
Right, if it's the right.
It's a very like depending on what it is and so forth, the size of the deal, the size of those aspects of it, versus if you're in like an FMCG, you're going to be trying to do that real volume perspective of how often is somebody going to go buy a Coke, a Pepsi, these kind of other things, that the impulse buys of your cycle. And so I don't know I know that I used to set up the sourcing for MQLs, etc. I used to be really strict with sales team and say that you can't do any cherry picking. If you need to go and talk to every single person that has been marked as qualified, because there might be a gem in there, or you need to tell me why you're not going to talk. Like, what were the signs that you saw there as to why you're not going to follow up with them or not going to do something, so that we can stop on the front part. And I think like the cherry picking was a big kind of issue, and saying, how do we reduce that? And to your point, is if they think if you're giving us a quantity, because maybe you've just gotten a list or something like this, what's happened in that relationship? What needs to happen in that relationship to make sure that you're qualified is better, that everyone's working together? Because again, in a classic standpoint, it's like marketing finds it, sales follows up, right? We're part of the same path. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that part?
I think the most important part of that is you have to have some sort of formal feedback loop.
Okay.
Like you have to force that conversation, even when it's awkward or even if it's volatile. You have to force that conversation. So create a real mechanism for sales to give the feedback to marketing, and build a culture in marketing that marketing's willing to listen to the feedback and that they're willing to try and activate. In a prior podcast, you and I had talked about how, marketing is about data now, and that we do a lot of experimentation. And so having marketing people being willing to hear the feedback, whether it's from sales or the executives or whatever the case is, and then to strategize, okay, how do we interpret this feedback that we're getting and how that might want to change some of the experimentation that we're doing on the front side? Because there's a lot of experimentation happening. Again, for me, in early STEM companies and startup companies, there's just a lot of experimentation happening because you don't really have the playbook yet. You're looking to build the playbook. So communication is definitely key.
And then we can kind of talk about, like, historically, the culture of a sales team can be very different than a culture of a marketing team. And and this is very stereotypical, but kind of this playbook of what a salesperson might look like is someone who's a bit more aggressive. They want to close. They tend to be the hunters, right? And then the marketing is the farmers. And do you have thoughts on, like, while you're working within the same ecosystem, you're working with the same goals in mind, but you culturally might have very different perspectives. Your teams might have very different cultures. Have you had times where you've needed to overcome that difference? So our tech is fine, our explanations are fine, we're aligned on all of that aspect of it. But what happens really when the cultural aspects can be a conflict or a help? And I'm curious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, definitely I've run into it many times at many different companies. I think it's normal. And I also think that it's something that as leaders, we have the opportunity to address. Culturally, the way that I communicate with my marketing teams is that marketing is a service organization.
Oh, okay.
And whether we're serving investor relations, whether we're serving the CEO and the CFO with annual messaging, whether we're servicing sales in terms of driving that top of funnel activity, I find that having a culture of service for the marketing department helps address a lot of those issues. Number one, it gets the initial relationship with sales off to a good start.
Sure.
Because they don't feel like there's going to be almost like a default to having that stress and tension. But I also think as a leader, it's really important to understand that sales ultimately owns the pipeline. They're ultimately accountable for the numbers. They're the ones that tend to lose their jobs quickly and in a big way when that top of funnel activity doesn't convert into sales. And I think part of my perspective on this has come from having been a salesperson and a marketing person and seeing things from both sides. And then also having been a CEO who was responsible for the joint performance of both of those organizations working together. Because in my earlier days, I thought of marketing and sales as peers and very, very equal in the process. And if anything, I thought, marketing is the one that operationalizes sales. We tell them what personas to go after, what markets to go after, and where they're going to get the most uptake. And, we're arming them with all of the sales materials, and therefore they are supposed to execute the playbook that we create. And so it's been a journey to get to the point where I actually think about the model in a very different way. But I have found that it actually eases the relationship going into a new organization to have that mindset, and we get to a common ground quicker culturally, if that makes sense. You get to a common ground quicker culturally coming in with that attitude. And it's not a popular attitude. Most of the marketing
I disagree with you.
I know. I can't wait to hear it. Because most of the peers that I have, they're like, you are so wrong. And I'm like, well, for me, it works. So I would love to hear your perspective.
So I have a perspective on a lot of those things. So I've never considered the sales wholly owning the pipeline. There's always been an aspect of marketing impacted pipeline, and whether or not that's sourced or whatever what we said. But where did marketing touch something to ease that space? And in that aspect where it's a shared responsibility, where marketing is a respected part of the organization that aids sales in a growth organization, that we're here to help create the engine that sales can feed from, right? Like, and support them throughout the space. And there is always a moment where when I'm talking to heads of CROs, et cetera, where's the moment that you want marketing to stop engaging because maybe you're in you're in commercials or something. Like, it is very much about that aspect. and it's interesting because I think there needs to be some sort of shared ownership, because quite frankly, and going back to the cultural aspect I was talking about, coming from a pure service led perspective, in my experience, is a opportunity to not be strategic, to be kind of walked all over, to be randomized. And I talk very honestly about when I'm trying to work with different clients, and what we're trying to do is really maximize in that triangulation. And I've said it before, of like the needs of the prospects with the wants of sales, with the optimum position of the company. And the thing is, because if you start to feed sales without any conditions,
Mm-hmm.
more often than not, what your marketing schedule is going to look like is a lot of events. And it's going to look like a randomization because you need support on this one document that's important to that salesperson at this particular time. And maybe I'm talking about process, and that's more about enabling teams with templates and informations and things like that. But that whole aspect of what the prospect needs and what the sales team wants is really a hurdle to consider. And so it is that aspect of, I definitely want to work collaboratively. I definitely want the sales team to have wonderful thought leadership and case studies. And I'm very passionate of understanding the sales person's experience and what are the questions that are being asked, and how can we ease that process, and how do we ease that process in scale, right? So that we're quote unquote feeding everyone that we can. But if it's a completely service-minded perspective, I'm never going to be able to build the automated digital programs that are going to enable the engine to keep going, because I've only encountered very few companies that have a wonderful events engine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very specific skill set amongst your marketing team and sales team, and making it something that's worthwhile for everyone. But it is this aspect that like sales loves events, because you can see it. You can see people in the room. You can see people signed up for the webinar. I'm in no way saying that that's a wrong approach. I'm just saying time and time again, a pattern that I see is they love the events. They want to talk about events first. But marketing has to have the autonomy or strategic perspective or value consideration of what the event is going to be successful because of the warming up that you did to get them in the room, and the continued warming up that's happening after they're in the room.
For sure.
That aspect. And I think those parts of it get ignored until you are 3 weeks in front of the event, and how is it looking, and did we go to the right people to invite to get to the place, etc. And so I find, I'm really, it's good to have that feedback loop for sure, and say what, I like to do, not like what questions are coming up more than 30% of the time. I need to create content to help you answer that. And that helps build trust for you, and it builds trust for us. But equally, I'm going to say, I'm going to spend time on a few of these digital programs that aren't webinars, that aren't those things, because this is going to set us up further. Those kind of things happen. Events are farther down the consideration line, right? Mm-hmm. What has to happen to make you do that? So it's really interesting to say the service, but I have asked in interviews of saying, like, what happens if you need to do this, which is some digital programming, and sales has asked you to do something completely randomized for a third tier prospect that's not going to move the needle. You have to be able to say no to it.
So you can. So being a service-oriented organization doesn't mean that you're controlled by or are basically a reporting structure into sales. Strategic things that you're talking about, I see those as a separate processes. So maybe part of this is semantics, because when I'm talking about that top of funnel activity, I'm talking about the folks who are doing demand gen, lead gen. Mm-hmm. But it's not without the context of having senior market leadership, triangulating with sales, triangulating with finance, triangulating with, CEO, and, as that strategic board, right, that makes these decisions. It's not to say that doesn't exist. That still exists, and it has to exist for there to be cohesiveness in the work that's being done.
Mhm.
But I do think it's really important that because I've seen it so many times, and I've been doing marketing now for over 40 years. And when sales is frustrated with the leads,
Oh, yeah.
it's a problem that has to be resolved. And being open to that feedback, I think, is really, really hypercritical, and finding it out as soon as possible too. So again, back to those feedback loops. So I think this is a good scenario where there's more than one right answer, which we've talked about a number of times. And I think the culture of the organization has to come into play. The culture of the leadership team has to come into play. And, everything's not always going to be architected the same exact way at every company, or else we'd be working from one playbook and you and I would have orchestrated things exactly the same.
Totally.
And we know that that's not how the real world works. I don't know. I think it's very interesting. I like the culture that it brings when a marketing leader communicates that it's their job to help make sure that the sales function is successful. There's a psychological aspect to that I think helps the sales leadership feel safe, knowing that, okay, I'm going to be able to talk to this person and tell them that something is or isn't working, or to ask them to double down on something because it's working great. And it's going to be a collaborative conversation as opposed to, a butting of the heads. So I think it just gets things off on a good start. But there again, I'm talking about startups where you're creating a lot of these things from scratch. And you have a lot of strangers coming into an environment, trying to figure out how they're going to work together for the first time. I think the culture may be a little bit different than when you're coming into a mature organization where you already have a lot of this infrastructure and business process in place.
Fair enough. So, closing thoughts, takeaways.
Oh boy, the proof's in the pudding. That's a takeaway. That's something that my mom always used to say. The proof is in the pudding, which is, the results matter. And so paying attention to the results and what activities drive the results. I think ultimately that's going to tell us whether or not we're on the right track or not, or if we need to make adjustments.
I like that. I think my key thought on the topic is really coming in with this collaborative mindset. Like, you're not competing against each other. You're here for the same results and collaboration for the company's success, right? The revenue is the part, the maintaining the relationships with your clients after they've become clients and then becoming advocates for your company, and just having those open conversations. I think that feedback loop is really important. I think setting those shared goals so that you have that combined vision is really, really key when you're having sales and marketing teams work together.
I agree with that. Great takeaway.
All right.
Well, this was a fun episode, and it was interesting because so many of our other episodes we align so closely. So it's fun when we don't, to have the conversation and talk about what those differences might be. It's kind of cool, actually.
No, I really enjoy it. I hadn't heard the be of service portion, but I like it, and it seems to work for you. So it's great.
It depends. It depends on the company, right? But yeah,
it's the intent.
Yeah, it tends to work.
Incredible. Well, thank you as always, and we will speak very soon.
All right. Thank you.
All the marketing and marketing for all.